Most people don't realize this, but some of the loneliest people are the ones who are never alone, surrounded by noise, by people, by constant conversation, yet still feeling empty inside. Because it's not about how many people are around you. It's about how deeply you've connected with yourself. And here's the truth no one really talks about. The most peaceful people aren't the ones with the busiest social lives. They're the ones who've made peace with their own presence. As the Buddha said, if you find no one to support you on the spiritual path, walk alone. There is no companionship better than solitude. That's not just a poetic quote. It's a call to discover something deeper within you. Today's video is going to guide you through something truly transformative. The joy of being alone. Not loneliness, not isolation, but the kind of solitude that leads to inner strength, self-trust, and a peace that doesn't depend on anyone else. If you've ever felt the pressure to constantly be connected or feared being by yourself, this is going to shift your perspective in a way that stays with you. We're going to talk about the Buddhist wisdom behind solitude and how it's not a weakness, it's a superpower. And if this kind of content speaks to your soul, if you appreciate what we're creating here together, there's one simple, free way you can support this journey. Just hit the subscribe button. It takes 1 second, and it helps us bring more of this timeless wisdom into a world that deeply needs it. Also, don't skip any part of this video, because each lesson builds on the one before it, and the final message might be the one your heart's been waiting to hear. Let's begin. There's a quiet kind of strength that comes from knowing when to walk away. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of wisdom. In life, we often find ourselves surrounded by people just for the sake of not being alone. We say yes to friendships, conversations, and connections that don't uplift us, sometimes even drain us, because being by ourselves feels uncomfortable or unnatural. But the Buddha taught something radically different. He said, if a man going down into a river, swollen and swiftly flowing, is carried away by the current, how can he help others across? In other words, if you lose your peace trying to keep others in your life, what are you really offering either to them or to yourself? In today's world where social connection is glorified and solitude is often misunderstood, choosing to be alone can feel like rebellion. But it's actually one of the most loving things you can do for yourself. Not all companies are good companies. Not all conversations feed the soul. Some people bring energy, wisdom, inspiration into your life, and others bring gossip, judgment, distraction, and chaos. The Buddha didn't sugarcoat this. He said very clearly, "It is better to dwell alone than with a fool." That's not an insult. It's a truth about how deeply our surroundings shape our mind. When you surround yourself with those who are constantly negative, caught in conflict, or stuck in shallow thinking, that energy seeps into your inner world. Over time, you start to feel restless, disconnected from yourself, and even more confused about who you are and what you value. This is why solitude is such a powerful choice, not because you're rejecting people, but because you're choosing to come home to yourself. It's about clearing the noise so your own thoughts can be heard again. Think about the last time you sat in silence without distraction. No phone, no scrolling, no small talk, just you. At first, it may feel strange, even uncomfortable. But if you sit with it, if you let yourself soften into that space, something incredible begins to happen. Clarity. You start to hear the thoughts beneath the noise. You remember things you've forgotten about yourself. Your intuition, which is usually drowned out, becomes louder. This is where growth starts, not in a crowd, but in the stillness of your own presence. The Buddha's life itself is a reflection of this truth. Before sharing his wisdom with the world, he spent years alone, meditating, observing, listening inwardly. He wasn't afraid of solitude because he understood what it offered. Solitude wasn't a punishment, it was preparation, a sacred container for insight and transformation. And that same space is available to you. When you step away from unwise company and into your own quiet company, you create space for healing, for renewal, and for remembering who you really are. This doesn't mean isolating yourself from everyone or cutting ties with loved ones. It means becoming more intentional. It means asking, who am I allowing into my mind and heart? And does their presence help me grow or pull me further away from my peace? Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is love someone from a distance while you nourish your own inner garden. You deserve to feel safe in your own energy. You deserve to be surrounded by people who understand, respect, and uplift you. But more than that, you deserve to know the beauty of your own presence, unfiltered, undistracted. Choosing solitude over unwise company isn't about being alone forever. It's about learning to enjoy your own space so fully that when you do invite others in, it's from a place of wholeness, not fear. There's something truly eye-opening that happens when you finally sit with yourself. No distractions, no noise, no one to impress or respond to. Just you. And suddenly you realize how little you actually know about the person you've been with your whole life. It sounds strange, doesn't it? But so many of us move through life surrounded by people, schedules, and responsibilities, yet we rarely pause to meet ourselves. We don't ask, who am I underneath all of this? And that's where solitude steps in, not as something to be feared, but as an invitation to return home to yourself. In Buddhist teachings, self-knowledge is considered essential to inner peace. The Buddha didn't just ask us to believe in something outside ourselves. He encouraged us to look inward, to understand our own minds, to become deeply familiar with the thoughts and emotions that guide our actions. This process is not about judgment, it's about awareness. And awareness can only grow when there's space for it. Solitude offers that space. It removes the external noise so that the internal voice, the one that often gets drowned out, can finally be heard. When you spend time in solitude, you start to notice things. You see patterns in your thinking. You recognize certain fears that keep showing up. You uncover quiet longings you've ignored for years. And through all of that, you begin to build a relationship with yourself that is based on honesty. No filters, no performance, just real presence. Buddhism teaches us that the greatest wisdom comes from knowing the workings of your own mind. And that wisdom isn't something you have to go searching for. It's already there, waiting to be discovered in the stillness. What's powerful about this process is that it also softens your relationship with yourself. When you're constantly surrounded by others, it's easy to get caught in comparison, in competition, in feeling like you need to be more. But in solitude, there's no one else to compare to. There's just you, and in that quiet, you start to see that you're not as broken or lost as you thought. You begin to understand that your feelings make sense, that your struggles have roots, and that your strengths are real even if others haven't always seen them. Solitude becomes a mirror, not to shame you, but to help you see clearly. The Buddha often spoke of knowing oneself as one really is, not as society sees you, not as your job title, your roles, your past mistakes, but as awareness itself, conscious, evolving, and inherently worthy. And the only way to truly meet that part of yourself is to spend time alone, intentionally, without judgment. This is not a once-in-a-while thing. It's a practice, just like meditation, just like mindfulness, a daily return to your center. The more time you spend with yourself, the more clarity you gain. Decisions become easier, not because life gets simple, but because you know what aligns with your values. You stop second-guessing every move. You stop needing others to validate your choices. You become more grounded, more intuitive, and more peaceful. And maybe most importantly, you become more compassionate with yourself and with others. Because once you understand your own mind, it's much easier to understand others. There's something deeply unsettling about silence when you're not used to it. When the noise of the world quiets down, when no one's texting, calling, or inviting you somewhere, it can feel like something's wrong, as if being alone means being forgotten, unwanted, or not enough. That discomfort, that sense of emptiness, is what keeps so many people chasing constant connection. But Buddhism teaches us to look beneath that fear, to sit with it rather than run from it. Because the fear of being alone isn't a sign that we're broken. It's a sign that we haven't yet learned how to be with ourselves. The Buddha never taught us to depend on others for our sense of peace. In fact, one of the most liberating teachings he gave was this: be a refuge unto yourself. Take refuge in the Dhamma. Take refuge in nothing else. In other words, your path to peace doesn't start with others, it starts with you. And if you're someone who feels uncomfortable in your own company, that's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to get curious about. Where does that discomfort come from? Why do we associate being alone with being unworthy? Much of the fear around solitude comes from the idea that we aren't enough on our own, that unless we're constantly receiving attention or affirmation, we somehow don't matter. But this belief is a trap. It keeps us chasing validation that never lasts. The moment we're alone again, the anxiety returns. That's not freedom, that's dependence. And Buddhism invites us to break free from that cycle by turning inward and learning to be content with our own presence. When you begin to spend time with yourself, not just scrolling on your phone or distracting yourself, but really being with yourself, something subtle starts to shift. At first, you might feel restless. Your mind will look for ways to escape. But if you stay with it, if you keep breathing and observing, you'll discover something powerful. You'll realize that being alone isn't the problem. It's your relationship with yourself that needs healing. And that healing begins the moment you stop running. The Buddha spent long periods in solitude, not because he rejected people, but because solitude created space for deeper insight. In silence, you begin to see the patterns of your mind. You witness your thoughts without interruption. You recognize how often your peace depends on things outside your control, and slowly, with patience, you begin to reclaim your inner world. You start to see that you are not your fears, your doubts, or your need for approval. You are the one who observes all of that. And that awareness is where freedom lives. Facing the fear of being alone isn't easy. It means confronting the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, the sadness, the insecurity, the memories you've buried. But every time you choose to stay present with those feelings instead of running, you grow stronger. You build emotional resilience. You learn that you don't need anyone else to complete you because you are already whole. That realization changes everything. You stop chasing people who don't value you. You stop settling for shallow connections just to avoid silence. You start choosing yourself, not out of ego, but out of deep respect. And here's what's truly beautiful. Once you're no longer afraid of being alone, you're no longer afraid of being yourself. You don't perform, you don't pretend, you simply are. And people can feel that. They're drawn to your calm, your confidence, your presence, but by then you're no longer seeking their approval because you've already found something greater, the quiet joy of being at home in your own heart. There's something deeply powerful that happens when the world gets quiet. When you're not pulled into someone else's drama, not distracted by notifications, not trying to live up to anyone's expectations. Just you, sitting with yourself, no noise, no pressure. And in that silence, something starts to rise, clarity. But that kind of clarity doesn't come from thinking harder or doing more. It comes from giving yourself the space to truly see. This is why solitude isn't just peaceful, it's sacred. In Buddhist teachings, silence is not just the absence of sound, it's the doorway to awakening. When the Buddha left his luxurious palace life in search of truth, he didn't walk into a crowd or ask others for the answers. he withdrew into forests, into silence, into deep solitude. It was in this quiet that he began to see his own mind clearly. He observed his thoughts, his cravings, his fears. He watched how the mind clings, how it wanders, how it reacts. And in that space, free from distractions, he discovered insight. That's what solitude offers us, not just rest, but revelation. When you're constantly surrounded by people, their words, their energy, even their opinions, can cloud your connection with yourself. You start living reactively, shaping your choices to fit what others think or expect. But when you step back, when you intentionally choose solitude, you give yourself the gift of returning to your own voice. It becomes easier to hear what you really feel, what you truly want, what's right for you, not based on someone else's version of success or happiness, but based on your own truth. Solitude is like a mirror. It shows you parts of yourself you might not notice when you're caught in the rush of life. Some of it may feel uncomfortable at first, old emotions, past regrets, self-doubt, but all of it is part of your healing. Buddhism teaches us that awareness is the path to liberation. You can't heal what you're too distracted to face. You can't grow if you don't know what's holding you back. But when you sit quietly with yourself, you start to see. And what you see, you can transform. This is why Buddhist practice emphasizes retreat, not as escape, but as reconnection. Whether it's formal meditation, quiet time in nature, or just sitting silently for 10 minutes each day, these small pockets of solitude become sacred ground for self-discovery. In that stillness, you may find clarity about a decision you've been avoiding. You may feel a deep knowing arise that you can't explain, but that you trust. You may remember a dream you've put off or realize that something you've been chasing no longer matters. These moments aren't loud, but they're life-changing. Solitude also helps you see your patterns, how you respond to stress, how you speak to yourself, what triggers your fears. And once you become aware of these patterns, you're no longer controlled by them. You start to choose more wisely, live more mindfully. The Buddha called this vipassana, insight, seeing clearly into the nature of things, not through analysis or overthinking, but through quiet observation. And perhaps one of the most beautiful things that unfolds in solitude is a sense of self-acceptance. When you spend enough time with yourself, without trying to change or fix everything, you begin to soften. You start to realize that you're not your thoughts, not your past, not your mistakes. You are the one observing it all, with kindness, with curiosity, with compassion. And that realization becomes the root of deep inner peace. There's a quiet kind of power that comes when you realize you can take care of yourself, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. You stop waiting for someone else to save you. You stop looking for someone to tell you what to do next, and you begin to trust that you already have what you need within you. This shift doesn't happen overnight, but it's one of the most liberating changes you'll ever experience. And it begins the moment you choose to stand on your own 2 feet, even when the ground feels uncertain. The Buddha didn't promise that others would carry us through life. He reminded us instead that no one saves us but ourselves. We ourselves must walk the path. That might sound intimidating at first, but what it really means is that we are not powerless, we are not helpless, we are not waiting to be fixed or completed by someone else. Buddhism teaches self-reliance not as a form of isolation, but as a practice of deep inner strength. Because the more we rely on our own wisdom, the more peaceful, resilient, and grounded we become. When you spend time alone, away from the noise and expectations of others, something begins to shift inside you. You begin to hear your own voice more clearly. You start to trust your own decisions, even if they go against the crowd. You stop asking for constant advice, and instead you pause, breathe, and check in with yourself. What feels right for me? That's the beginning of self-trust. And that trust is built in solitude. When you have the space to make your own choices and the courage to live with them. Sometimes we confuse independence with coldness, as if being strong means never needing anyone. But Buddhism doesn't ask us to shut others out. It asks us to first build stability within ourselves so that we can show up to others with a full heart, not an empty cup. When you're grounded in your own being, you don't enter relationships because you need to. You enter them because you choose to. And that choice comes from strength, not fear. It's not about cutting ties, it's about knowing that your happiness doesn't depend on anyone else's behavior, attention, or approval. Think about how often we give away our power without even realizing it. We wait for someone else to encourage us before we move forward. We hesitate to trust our gut until someone else confirms it. We question our feelings if they're not validated. But the Buddha encouraged us to look inward again and again. He said, "Be a lamp unto yourself." That means your light doesn't have to come from outside. You can shine by standing in your truth, even if no one else sees it yet. Learning to rely on yourself also means accepting responsibility for your peace. It's no longer about blaming the world when things go wrong. It's about saying, "This is mine to work through. This is my path to walk." And as hard as that sounds, it actually brings a deep kind of relief. Because now, your healing isn't dependent on whether others change. It's dependent on how you show up for yourself. This kind of inner strength shows up in the little moments, when you hold space for your own emotions instead of running from them, when you speak kindly to yourself after making a mistake, when you stay committed to your values even when it's uncomfortable. Every time you do that, you build a deeper relationship with yourself, one that isn't shaken by other people's opinions or moods. There's a kind of quiet joy that no one really teaches us about, the joy of simply being with yourself. No performance, no pressure, no need to impress anyone or explain anything. Just you, being you. And that's where real peace begins. Because when you strip away all the external noise, the expectations, the opinions, the endless need for approval, what you're left with is a rare kind of freedom. A space where you can actually hear your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, and reconnect with the person you were before the world told you who to be. Buddhism teaches us that this kind of self-connection isn't selfish, it's sacred. And in that sacred connection, we discover something truly powerful, the ability to become our own best companion. In a world obsessed with constant connection and validation, self-companionship can feel foreign, even uncomfortable at first. We're told from a young age that happiness comes from being liked, being accepted, being surrounded. But the Buddha's teachings gently remind us otherwise. He taught that the source of true contentment lies within, not outside of us, and that if we can't enjoy our own company, no amount of external approval will ever be enough. The mind will always search, always crave, always chase, until we learn to sit with ourselves, not to fix or judge, but simply to be. That's where peace starts to grow. Think about how you treat the people you love most. You listen to them, you forgive them, you show them patience, compassion, encouragement. But when it comes to ourselves, we're often quick to criticize, quick to judge, quick to believe we're not enough. But the Buddha taught that you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. Let that settle in. You don't need to wait to be perfect to be kind to yourself. You don't need to achieve more, fix more, or prove more. You're already worthy of your own love, right here as you are. Self-companionship means learning to enjoy the stillness, not escaping it, not filling it with noise, but embracing it as a sacred space. A space where you can return to yourself, where you can listen deeply. Maybe that looks like a quiet walk or sitting with a cup of tea and no distractions. Maybe it's journaling or just closing your eyes and breathing. In these moments, you're not doing it for anyone else. You're not performing. You're simply being with the most important person in your life, you. As your relationship with yourself deepens, something beautiful begins to happen. You stop chasing validation. You stop needing to be chosen by others. in order to feel worthy. You start honoring your own presence, and that shifts everything from how you handle conflict to how you show up in relationships. You become grounded, whole. You no longer enter relationships from a place of need, but from a place of fullness. You're no longer trying to be completed by someone else. You're already complete, and you know it. One of the most underestimated gifts of self-companionship is emotional stability. When you know how to support yourself, soothe yourself, and return to your center, you become far less reactive to the chaos around you. Criticism doesn't break you. Loneliness doesn't scare you. Rejection doesn't define you, because you've built something strong and steady within, a deep trust in yourself. And that trust is like an anchor. It holds you when the world gets loud. This doesn't mean you isolate yourself or cut off connection. It means you create from overflow, not emptiness. You can still love deeply, connect fully, and show up for others, but without losing yourself in the process. That's the beauty of being your own companion first. You become a steady presence in your own life. And from that place of wholeness, every relationship you enter becomes more honest, more balanced, and more meaningful. There's a quiet kind of power that comes from knowing who you are and not needing anyone else's permission to be that person. But it's not always easy to feel that way, especially when the world constantly pushes you to fit in. From the time we're young, we're taught to follow the crowd, blend in, meet expectations, and do what's normal. And slowly, without even noticing, we begin to silence the parts of us that feel different. We hold back, we shrink, we copy others, all to feel accepted. But the Buddha reminded us that freedom doesn't come from pleasing the world. It comes from walking your own path, with courage and presence. In Buddhism, individuality isn't seen as separation. It's seen as authenticity. You don't have to reject others to find yourself, but you do have to stop abandoning your truth just to belong. When the Buddha left his palace, he didn't follow the path laid out for him. He chose solitude. He chose silence. He chose self-inquiry. He chose something different. And that's what allowed him to discover wisdom that changed the world. His journey teaches us that sometimes the most meaningful paths are the ones we walk alone, especially when they reflect our inner truth. When you spend time alone, free from the noise and opinions of others, something beautiful happens. You begin to hear yourself clearly, your real voice, not the one shaped by trends or fear or social roles, but the voice underneath, the one that says, "This is who I am." That's the beginning of valuing your individuality, not as something to fix, but as something to honor. You start to notice what actually brings you peace, what lights you up, what kind of life feels true to you, not what others told you it should look like. There's a deep kind of strength that grows when you no longer compare your timeline to someone else's. When you stop measuring your worth by someone else's path, that kind of freedom allows you to live with intention. You make decisions based on your own values. You set boundaries that honor your peace. You follow your curiosity without needing applause. This isn't arrogance, it's spiritual maturity. It's what the Buddha meant when he said, "Be a lamp unto yourself." Not because you're better than others, but because your light is different and the world needs all kinds of light. You may find that not everyone understands the real you. That's okay. Buddhism teaches impermanence. Everything changes, including relationships. And sometimes when you begin to live more truthfully, you outgrow certain people, places, or situations. But instead of seeing that as loss, see it as space being made for people who appreciate your authenticity. The more you honor your uniqueness, the more you attract genuine connections, people who resonate with your energy, not just your image. It also becomes easier to connect with others in a compassionate way when you're grounded in your own truth. You stop needing others to validate you, and you start meeting them with openness, without pretending to be someone you're not. This creates real relationships, not ones based on performance but on presence. And the most beautiful part, the more you accept your individuality, the more you give others permission to do the same. Your presence becomes a quiet reminder to others that they too can live honestly, that they don't have to fake it to belong, that there is space in this world for their truth too. That's the ripple effect of authenticity. When you finally stop chasing who you think you should be and start embracing who you already are, that's when true peace begins. You don't need to fit in to feel whole. You don't need to be louder to be seen. The quiet strength of being fully unapologetically yourself is more than enough. As the Buddha taught, the path to freedom starts from within, from walking your own path with clarity, kindness, and courage. If this message spoke to your heart, there's another video waiting on your screen right now to guide you even deeper. And as always, thank you for being here, and thank you for being a part of Buddhist journey.